Yes, actually, my dad and the plane, my dad was the last one to bail out because he was the commander or captain, if you want, if you will. They came down in Belgium, and the rest of the crew that bailed out came down and across the border in France. They were brought back over the border into Belgium, either by Germans who captured them or by members of the resistance who brought them to safe houses in Belgium. And then their adventures, all took place after that.
Welcome to Heroes Behind Headlines. I'm your host, Ralph Pizzulo. Please subscribe and check out some of our recent past episodes, such as leading Marines in the fight for Ramadi, growing up homeless, and the man behind MK Ultra. Our guest today is award-winning author Steve Snyder, whose book Shot Down is the amazing true story of his father, Howard J. Snyder, who was a B-17 pilot during World War II. The book recounts the dramatic experiences of each member of Howard Snyder's 10-man B-17 bomber crew after their plane was knocked out of the sky by German fighters over the French-Belgium border on February 8, 1944. Some men died. Others were captured and became prisoners of war. A few evaded capture and were missing in action for months before making it back to England. Their individual stories and those of the courageous Belgian people who risked their lives to help them are remarkable and inspiring. Howard's son, Steve, is with us today to share his father's story of survival and joining the Belgian resistance, which he wrote with the help of letters, declassified military documents, his father's personal diary, and interviews, including one with a German Luftwaffe pilot who shot down his father and his crew. I'm honored to welcome award-winning author Steve Snyder as today's hero behind the headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines with Ralph Pizzulo.
I was born in Pasadena, California, as my mother was. Mm-hmm. Went to UCLA as my mother did. After I graduated, I always want to live at the beach, so I moved to Seal Beach, California, which is in Orange County, about 40 miles south of LA. My career job was 40 years in sales and sales management. The last 36 years was for a company called Vision Service Plan, VSP. Mm-hmm. They provide vision care as an employee benefit that corporations offer their employees to cover eye exams, glasses, and contact lenses. And in 2009, I retired. Mm-hmm. And then I had the time to really delve into my dad's war history in more detail. Growing up, I knew the basics of his World War II experiences. He was a B-17 pilot. He was stationed in England with the 8th Air Force. His plane was named the Susan Ruth after my oldest sister, who was 1 year old at the time that he went overseas. He flew bombing missions over occupied Europe, and in February of 44, his plane was shot down, and he was missing in action for 7 months. But he evaded capture and got back to England.
Yeah.
My parents had kept a lot of material from the war years, and I just wanted to go through that and organize it and learn some more details. And there are two items that were really significant. One was a diary that my dad wrote while he was missing in action, which is absolutely riveting. Mm-hmm. And the other were all the letters that my mother kept that my dad had written to her. And he was really candid in those letters. He talked about what bombing missions were like, what life was like in the air base, what life was like in London and England at the time, escapades of him and his crew. And I just became fascinated with this story, and it became my passion. Mm-hmm. I started reading book after book about the era over Europe, went on the internet, spent countless hours doing research. I contacted relatives of all my dad's crew to find out whatever information they could give to me. And finally, 3 years into my research, I just came to the conclusion that the story was so unique and so compelling that it needed to be told. So I wrote a book.
Fantastic. So let's talk a little bit about your dad and his background, because he didn't grow up in Pasadena.
He was born in Norfolk, Nebraska, mm-hmm. In a rural little tiny town. I've been there a couple of times. In fact, the house he grew up in is still there. Mm-hmm. And, he did a lot of hunting and fishing. He had a pony. So he had the outdoor life. And then he moved with his family to Glendale, California, which is right next to Pasadena, right before starting high school. And he graduated from Glendale High School. He was the captain on the basketball team. He loved basketball.
Mm-hmm.
And then he met Ruth Hempel, my mother. They were both in Walther League, which was a youth organization in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. After he graduated from high school, he went to work. He didn't go on to college. A lot of people back then didn't go to college. He worked for Desmond's Clothing Company in Los Angeles. And then with the first peacetime draft, it was implemented in the fall of 1940 by President Roosevelt. My dad went into the Army, actually, to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
In April of 1941, he married my mother 3 months later in July, and he was stationed at Fort Lewis, Washington. Then Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th of 41, and my mother was pretty concerned and pretty nervous about the future. So she went up to visit my dad over Christmas in Washington. Then 9 months later, Susan Ruth was born, and he was worried about how he was going to support him at the time. He had a new bride, a baby on the way, and didn't think he could do that very well in a private's pay in the Army. So that's why he volunteered for the Air Force to make more money, especially if he could make it through pilot training and become an officer.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was a great guy. My two sisters, we always compared him to John Wayne.
Uh-huh.
Or for people who might remember the old Gunsmoke TV series, James Arness. My dad was a big guy, a rugged guy, no-nonsense guy. Things were black and white. Had a strong devotion to his country, strong faith, Christian faith, and things were either right or wrong. And he was disciplinarian, but he was a very loving father. We were close. He coached my little league team, and we had a great relationship. I think, those strong principles of that generation and foundation is, what helped him during the war and after he was shot down.
Right. Had he ever been a pilot before?
No. There weren't that many pilots.
I was going to,
in the U.S. Right. When before the war started. And the military trained thousands and thousands of pilots, and these guys that just became citizen soldiers, they were just recruited. But the only reason he went into the Air Force is just to make more money.
So he goes into training, and how does that go?
He started with pre-flight training at Santa Ana Army Air Base in Southern California. And there they qualified the cadets. They put them through not only physical training, but they had to give a lot of like college type courses like aerodynamics and meteorology and physics. And so you had to be, physically fit, but also pretty mentally sharp as well. And then he passed that and went through the 3 stages of pilot training: primary, basic, and advanced training. Pilot training was rough. 40% of the cadets washed out.
Wow. And
they became bombardiers or navigators. And then primary training, I'm in Santa Maria, California. He soloed for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went to basic training and then advanced training, where he graduated in April of 1943, where he received his commission as a second lieutenant in his pilot wings. And then from there, he went to transitional training, where he learned how to fly a 4-engine B-17 bomber. And then from there, he went to operational crew training down in Texas, where the various members of the crew came together and they learned to operate as a team. And then once deemed ready, they were assigned overseas to the European Theater of Operations. Mm-hmm. On October 21st of 43, he and his crew reported to the 306 Bomb Group at Thurlow, England.
The U.S. war strategy at the time was to destroy Nazi industrial and military targets deep behind enemy lines using long-range heavy B-17 and B-24 bombers. Instead of launching these bomb runs at night like the British did, the U.S. chose precision daylight raids using the top-secret Norden Mark 15 bomb sight. The strategy of precision daylight bombing put U.S. pilots and crews at tremendous risk. Adolf Hitler and German Air Commander Hermann Goering were convinced that the Americans could never sustain the heavy losses of air crews and planes that the German Luftwaffe could inflict.
He arrived on October 21st, and 1 week earlier, on October 14th, what was referred to as Black Monday, the 8th Air Force sent 291 B-17s to bomb the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt, Germany. And 60 of those bombers were shot down, 600 men.
Wow.
10 of the 15 B-17s that the 306 bomb group sent up were shot down. So he was actually one of the replacement crews because they'd lost so many crews on that mission. But he went into every bomb group had 4 bomb squadrons, and he was in the 369th bomb squadron, which when he reported, they had the longest streak of missions without a loss of any bomb squadron in the entire 8th Air Force.
Wow.
So he felt pretty good about it. He was getting in with a good bomb squadron.
Yeah.
In fact, they held the record. I think it was 42 missions without losing a plane. That record wasn't broken until after D-Day, when the Luftwaffe had basically been decimated and they were just a shell of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But it was pretty exciting, for both him and really all the guys. It was an adventure. So he was pretty excited about it and pretty enthusiastic.
Mm-hmm.
He was proud to be a B-17 pilot, and also, back then, and even though all these planes were being shot down, those guys were young and thought they were invincible, and if anything happened to somebody, it'd be the other guy, not themselves.
Right. Let's talk about the B-17 for a moment, because it was kind of an extraordinary plane when you look back at it, and it had a big crew, a 10-man crew.
Yeah, no one had seen anything like that when they rolled it off. The first prototype in Seattle at the Boeing plant. One of the newspapermen, reporters there, exclaimed that it's a flying fortress. That's how it's got its nickname, because it was so big and it could fly so fast and fly so high, and it was heavily armed with all these machine guns, like 50 caliber machine guns. They could put out a tremendous amount of firepower.
Yeah.
So it was an amazing plane. And actually, there were 3 models of the B-17 that were flown in Europe. The first was the E model, but they only made about 500 of those. So that was replaced by the F model. And then eventually the F model was replaced by the definitive B-17 model, the G model, in fall of 1943. And you can always tell the G model because it has a chin turret underneath the nose of the plane. And also the B-17 could take a tremendous amount of battle damage and keep flying. Some of these bombers would come back from missions and, it looked like, how could they possibly be fine?
Yeah.
Not only would engines be out, but there'd be, the tail or a vertical stabilizer would be all almost shot away and holes all in the plane. But
incredible.
Those B-17 combat crews loved the B-17 because it brought them back from a lot of missions. If you looked at it, you'd say, well, how the heck could that thing even fly?
Yeah, but it was very vulnerable also because it wasn't an armored plane, and especially to German fighter planes, it was kind of a sitting duck.
At the beginning of the air war, it was 8th Bomber Command's belief that these heavily armed bombers, and they flew in these formations with hundreds of bombers at a time.
Yeah.
They flew in tight formations, referred to as a combat box. So they flew wingtip to wingtip. So the thought was, all that interlacing firepower could ward off the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe. But sadly, that was not the case.
Yeah.
These bombers couldn't defend themselves. And in the early years of the war, 42, 43, they didn't have fighter escorts that could escort the bombers all the way into Germany and back. The fighters at the time in early years of the war could escort them across the English Channel, but then they'd run low on fuel and have to turn back to their bases in England. And then the Luftwaffe would just wait for these fighters to turn back and just come in and decimate them.
Wow.
Up until April of 43, there was no mission limit for these combat crews. They just would fly and fly. And, the morale started sinking terribly because these crews realized that they would never ever make it home.
Yeah.
They'd either be killed or shot down and become prisoners of war.
Yeah.
So in April of 43, it was actually the flight surgeon of the 306 bomb group, Thurman Schuler, that suggested to 8th Bomber Command Ira Aker to implement a mission limit. He suggested 20. Aker set it at 25, but at least those combat crews had a light at the end of the tunnel, and some hope of making it home. But even though they implemented that mission limit of 25, in 1943, it was statistically impossible to complete 25 missions. The average number of missions flown before being shot down was 6.
Wow. And these guys knew that.
Yeah.
And still they went out and they flew missions.
Yeah. Being a combat crewman in the 8th Air Force was the most dangerous duty assignment in the United States military during World War II.
Wow.
26,000 men in the 8th Air Force were killed, which is more than the entire Marine Corps fighting in the Pacific.
Incredible.
And another 28,000 men became prisoners of war after their bombers were shot down. And it was dangerous from the time they took off to the time they landed. And as you said, these guys just kept going back up, even and knowing that the next mission could be their last.
I mean, just flying in tight formation like that in bad weather conditions, because they were not as sophisticated in terms of radar and all the sophistications that aircraft have today. When they arrived on the target, they had to go on to automatic pilot. It was like the pilot sort of gave up. He relinquished control of the airplane. Can you describe that? I found that very interesting.
Yes. When they neared the target, they reached a pre-designated point called the initial point, the IP, and that's where they started their bomb run. And at that point, the first pilot, my dad, would give control over the plane to the bombardier, who would fly the plane through the Norden bomb sight in the nose, which was a revolutionary device. It was tied into the autopilot of the plane. And it was an analog computer that could take into consideration, and calculate various factors such as the speed of the plane, the altitude the plane was flying, wind speed, wind direction, to accurately drop the bombs. And when they started the bomb run, they had to fly, straight and steady and without any evasive action, so they could accurately drop the bombs. So then they were pretty sitting ducks for the anti-aircraft fire that was coming up at them. Flak. Flak was the abbreviation for the German word for aircraft defense cannon, which were deadly weapons. They could fire 20 shells a minute, and the shells were calibrated to explode at the same altitude that these bombers were flying. And the shells were filled with all different shapes and sizes of razor-sharp metal called shrapnel, that when the shell exploded, it would burst out hundreds of feet and easily penetrate the thin aluminum skin of these bombers. The skin on these bombers was so thin you could take a screwdriver and just poke it right through it.
Wow.
My dad said even though it was so cold at that altitude, it was minus 40 to 60 degrees below zero, that he would just be dripping wet with, sweat, and his clothes would be drenched because of the adrenaline running through his system.
Sure. Oh my God. I can't even imagine, what an experience. And then you've got the responsibility of 9 other men as well. Right. And you've got a guy all the way in the back, the tail gunner, and he couldn't even really sit down. He would kind of crouch in this plexiglass bubble in a flak suit, in an armored suit that you said weighed like 60 pounds or something like that.
Yeah, I've been in B-17s and flown up in before, and to get back to the tail, you have to crawl around the tail assembly, and it's really cramped in there. And as you said, the tail gunner would sit in kind of a kneel-sit position. He had kind of a little tiny bench, so he'd sit on it, but he was on his knees. And so he's there hours on end, which was really uncomfortable. That and the ball turret, a really cramped position. And so both the ball turret gunner, who was, beneath the plane in a plexiglass turret, and then the tail gunner, they were really isolated from the other members of the crew.
So let's talk about just sort of conditions in England at the time, because it sounded as though the British were happy to see the American pilots. And at the same time, neither the British or the Americans had that much exposure to one another before. So they were sort of these very different cultures getting to know one another on the fly.
Absolutely. They refer to it as the friendly invasion. Because here's, the only exposure that the English people, the Brits had were movies. So they kind of assumed everyone was a cowboy. And, England was hundreds and years old, and it was very provincial, very conservative. And then here you had all these young, brash American guys that, a lot of these guys, well, back then, the U.S. was a very rural country.
Sure.
Most people lived out, in rural areas, not in cities. A lot of these guys had never even been out of their home county.
Yeah.
Here they are, teenagers or early 20s, and they find themselves halfway around the world. In London, which was the most spectacular city in the world at that time.
Yeah.
It was very cosmopolitan. Here you had these guys away from home for the first time, away from their families, away from their mothers.
Yeah.
And they could do anything they wanted. They could drink, they could smoke, they could chase women.
This is a letter Howard Snyder wrote on June 22nd, 1941, when he was staying in the town of Bedford, England. Quote, "You have no idea how 4 years of war has affected England. Luxuries are taxed at 100% of cost, so everything is terribly high. No one can buy clothing without ration slips. It is practically impossible to get anything. There just isn't anything here that isn't used in the war effort. The town is a good-sized place, but there isn't anything to do unless you're on the lookout for girls. The climate gives them beautiful complexions. When I see the English women and think of you, I can't believe that there is much difference. How fortunate I am that I was blessed with you for a wife. We are not allowed to say anything detrimental about the English, but there is not much to say. They are very fine people, but the 4 years of war they have gone through must have done something to their morale."
It was a whole new world for these guys. And
Yeah.
England was totally different. For example, when they trained, in the U.S., all the air bases were in Arizona and Texas in the middle of nowhere. And here the bases in England were right down in the middle of the countryside with all these little towns and farms. And so they were just plopped down. And so it was a culture shock to both.
Yeah.
It took a while for the Brits because the Brits were very, reserved. You didn't show emotion, and the Americans, the GIs, they were very forward and not formal whatsoever. Kind of just said whatever was ever on their mind, and
Yeah.
so it took a while for both sides getting used to each other. In fact, the U.S. military made up a pamphlet, which I had.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of an introduction to the English and how it's different and how you have to watch what you say, because if you say things, have different meanings over there. And
Right.
But I will say that the British women love the GIs.
Yeah.
For one thing, they were paid well. They got like 5 times the pay a British.
No, the British were really sort of living under very difficult circumstances because they had gone through the Blitz, and a lot of the men were overseas, and there were strict rationing of everything.
Oh, yes.
And as you say, these guys show up with money to spend, and it's like, whoopee, here we go. Right?
Yeah, those, when the first U.S. troops got to England, England had been at war for 3 years.
Yeah.
And the country had been bombed by Germany, and they had blackouts. And as you said, that the GIs had plenty of spending money. The Brits, they couldn't get chocolate. Women couldn't get nylons, and
Yeah.
so these GIs had all this money to spend on the girls there and take them out to restaurants and in London and show them a good time. But the British men, they weren't too happy about that, because here the GIs are stealing their girls and they have all this money to lavish on them.
Right.
They said, the GIs were over here overpaid and oversexed.
And I think you say in the book somewhere that there were 70,000 British women who ended up marrying GIs.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot.
Oh, yeah. There are a lot of war brides that came back to the U.S. and, there's no telling how many British women became pregnant and then their boyfriend, went back to the States. And, I've met people that, never knew their dad. Their mother got pregnant and there they go.
Yeah. Wow. Let's talk about your dad's first mission and when he first starts to fly missions to Europe.
Yeah, his first mission was on October 3rd of 1943 to Wilhelmshaven, Germany. It was the first time the 8th Air Force put up over 500 planes on a mission.
Wow.
And that mission went pretty smoothly. They didn't encounter a lot of, the flak wasn't too bad, and they didn't encounter very enemy fighters. So, but he thought it was very, thrilling and invigorating, and, it got your adrenaline in pumping because you didn't know what to expect.
I'm sure.
He mentioned, in some of those letters that he actually became to enjoy the missions.
Mm-hmm.
He got over his fear. You were concentrating so much on flying the plane.
In early November 1943, Howard wrote this to his wife, Ruth, quote, "I've been on my first mission. They call the fellows virgins until they have their first mission in, so we have had our cherries popped, if you'll pardon the expression. 24 more to go. They won't be as easy as this one. It gives one an awful, sickening sensation in one's stomach to see a big flying fortress go down like a great stricken monster. I must admit I was a little nervous, even though it was exceptionally easy. I guess because it was my first raid. When you think of the damage we do, it is a very cheap price to pay."
It was strenuous both mentally and physically to fly those bombers. Back then you really took muscle to fly. It was not like today's plane.
Yeah.
And you had to fly in tight formations, so you had to stay alert at all times, or you could clip a wing on the plane next to you or run on the plane in front of you and go down.
Yeah.
And you had to constantly fight the turbulence, not only the air turbulence from the weather that, all of us have experienced, but with all those bombers being in such close proximity to one another, you had the wake turbulence and the prop wash would just churn the air. So,
wow.
So, you had to really concentrate. So you kind of, your concentration was on the job, not on, I might be shot down.
Right. You couldn't even think of that. You didn't have time. I don't think history has been emphasized enough, the impact of the air war, the bombing war of the Allies on the Germans, because even though these guys were taking tremendous risks and getting shot down, they were having a huge impact on the war.
Absolutely. They flew high-altitude daylight precision bombing missions, and their goal was to hit military and industrial targets to cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. Mm-hmm. The Brits, they flew at night, and they didn't do precision bombing. They did what was area or carpet bombing, and they bombed cities. The British thought if they could bomb cities, they would demoralize the German population, that they would put pressure on the Nazis to end the war. So they had a whole different philosophy. The Brits bombed at night, the U.S. bombed during the daytime, so it was around-the-clock bombing. The U.S. philosophy, they didn't want collateral damage, even though there was collateral damage.
Yeah.
So they were very effective, but they as I mentioned earlier, they couldn't be effective without fighter support.
Yeah.
And finally, at the end of 1943 and the beginning of 1944, the P-51 Mustang was introduced, which was could escort the bombers all the way deep into Germany and back again.
Yeah.
And in January of 1944, Jimmy Doolittle took over the command of the 8th Air Force. And rather than just sticking with the bombers and protecting them and staying with them, all the way to the target and back, he said, go after the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
So in the spring of 1943, they would use the B-17s as bait to bring the Luftwaffe up, and then those P-51 Mustangs and also the P-47 Thunderbolts with external fuel tanks, they would go after the Luftwaffe, not only in the air, but on the ground. They'd search for the Luftwaffe bases and shoot these German planes trying to take off, trying to land, or if they're just parked on the tarmac, they would just go in and just strafe the tarmac. So the P-51s really won the air war.
So your dad also, while he's a pilot, he's also like a really valuable member of the base basketball team.
Right.
And he even sort of, in one of the letters, kind of complains to his wife, I'm not sure if I'm here as a pilot or as a basketball player, because the commander was a basketball fan and was really relying on your father. And then at one point he gets injured, and that thwarts his flying career. And your dad is sort of intent on flying his 25 missions and returning home, and keeps in his letters, talks about that. But then, he gets sidelined.
Yeah. Yeah, the commanding officer of his squadron, the 369th, he has all these records on these guys, coming in. And so he saw that my dad played a lot of basketball. After high school, he played on a lot of AAU teams. There was no professional basketball. And so the guys that were good played AAU ball, Amateur Athletic Union. And so we recruited my dad to play center on the basketball team. My dad was 6'3", back then.
Yeah, that's huge.
Played
Yeah.
center.
Yeah.
And evidently, my dad was pretty good. And so my dad jokingly said in one of the letters to my mother, as you alluded to, that he thought this commanding officer was more interested in winning basketball games and flying combat missions. And they won the base, championship basketball. He tore the ligaments at his ankle playing basketball, and he couldn't fly for 2 months, which really upset him because, as you mentioned, he wanted to fly and get those missions out of the way as soon as possible, so he'd come back home to his wife Ruth and his little daughter Susan.
Yeah.
And also, my mother was pregnant while he was overseas.
Yeah.
And so that, really curtailed. And as a result, some of the members of my dad's crew had, a lot more missions than he did. Some had fewer, because guys were getting sick all the time with that English weather, and then also getting injured, on missions. It did give him a chance to see the country. They went up with another pilot up to Scotland and toured London more, so that kind of gave him a perspective. But just kind of sitting around for 2 months, he didn't enjoy that very much.
And so he starts flying again. What is it, January of 44?
Yes.
And then he's just flying one mission after another.
Yeah, he was loving that. Although flying, if you're flying missions day after day, you really get tired, because
I would imagine
those combat crews after a mission are just exhausted. All they wanted to do was just go back to their room and just fall asleep. But he was loving all those combat missions, and then unfortunately they came to an end.
Yeah. So let's talk about that mission. And that was February 8th, 1944.
Right. It was a bombing mission to Frankfurt, Germany. They dropped their bombs successfully, but their bomb bay doors got hit by flak, and they couldn't get the doors back up. And as a result, that caused a drag in the plane, and they lost airspeed and fell behind the bomber formation, heading back to their bases in England. And they were singled out by 2 German Focke-Wulf fighters who, like lions or prey, came in for the kill on a wounded bomber, and they shot the Susan Ruth down. But both those Focke-Wulf pilots were shot down. Siegfried Merrick, his plane crashed and he was killed in the plane. And then the other plane was piloted by Hans Berger, who was able to bail out, and he made it through the war. And
you got a chance to meet him.
Yeah, one day during my research, my wife Glenda, said, "Well, why don't you try to find the German pilot that shot down your dad's plane?"
Yeah,
like it was a simple thing, and I'm thinking to myself, "Oh, she's naive. She has no idea what she's talking about. That'd be impossible. He probably died during the war,
right?
As so many German pilots did, or it's 70 years later, he passed away by now. I can't speak German anyway. How am I going to communicate with the guy?" But like a good husband, I did what she told me to do. And amazingly, I found Hans Berger. And fortunately for me, he became a translator after the war, speaks perfect English. And I found out from Hans that the gunners on my dad's plane actually shot him down at the same time he shot my dad's plane down. They shot each other down.
Wow.
So that was pretty amazing. I became good friends with Hans.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he just passed away this past January 20th at age 100.
Wow. On your website, you have a film where you actually sit down with him. And he seems like this really kindly gentleman, no animosity at all.
No, yeah. Fortunately, I've made 2 trips to Munich, Germany, where, he lived after the war, and got to know him better. For the book, I just interviewed him through email and over the telephone. After I wrote the book, I was able to meet him in person. And no, he said, it was unfortunately that they had to be shooting at each other, but, that was war. He was pretty much just like the U.S. airman, 19, 20 years old, trying to do a job, fighting for his country and trying to stay alive.
Yeah, incredible. So let's talk about the circumstances of the crash, because they're pretty dramatic. The plane catches on fire, and everybody's trying to bail out, and they have to find their parachutes, and they have to wait for the order from your father.
Yeah, they were attacked, and they just made one pass, but they just riddled the Susan Ruth. Everyone on the plane was injured to some degree or another. So 2 of the guys in the plane, the radio operator and the ball turret gunner, were killed. The bombardier and one of the waist gunners had very serious injuries, and the cockpit became on fire. My dad had actually, I think, passed out for a few moments. As I mentioned, his account in his diary, detailed account, is amazing. The horror and the chaos in that plane was unbelievable. And my dad, they have an intercom system, but he didn't know if that was knocked out or not. And they also have like a bailout bell. But, he didn't know. He pressed that, but he didn't know if it was working, because the 4 officers were in the front of the plane. You have the bombardier, the navigator, the 2 pilots, and then also the flight engineer, who's not an officer. And then you have the bomb bay. And then you have the rest of the crew behind the bomb bay. So my dad had no idea what was happening at all in the back of the plane.
Yeah.
So he didn't know. He just assumed that if they didn't hear the bailout alarm or his bailout call, that they would realize that they had to get out of the plane because it was going down.
Steve's father wrote this about the crash, quote, "Then, as my mind seemed to clear a bit more, I too became absolutely terrified. I had been frightened before, but never completely lost my wits from terror. It was horrible. I tried to yell or scream, but the sound died in my throat, and my open mouth emitted no sound. I tried to jump out of my seat, but my safety belt held me there. My only thought was to get out of that terrible fire. I clawed wildly for my safety belt. I could not realize in my terrorized and stupefied mind how I could not find it. It was only with great mental effort that I figured out why and started my thought process again. As I looked down and realized what the trouble was, a little of the terror left me. But it wasn't until I had thrown off my flak suit from me and unfastened my safety belt that I regained control of myself.
So eight of the crew were able to bail out of the plane before it came down.
Mm-hmm.
Then various things happened to each guy.
Yeah, and your dad seemed to be extraordinarily lucky because he bails out. His parachute didn't open, correct?
It's interesting about these guys that bail out. They're unlike paratroopers that practice jumping out of planes.
Right.
These combat crewmen, they got, classroom instruction on what to do, but they had never, ever bailed out of a plane to do.
Yeah.
And when it's on fire and your adrenaline's rushing and you're in terror and, trying to fight for your lives, and you don't know whether this parachute's going to open or not. And they usually tell you, we'll count, so many seconds and then pull the ripcord, or when you see the ground, pull the ripcord. Well, my dad, and you're falling through clouds.
Yeah.
So, you can't really see the ground unless there's a break in the clouds. So, I mean, all this is going on.
Yeah, in seconds.
And then they do have the ripcord, but then there's another ripcord too if the main one doesn't open.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, my dad, he's falling, he's counting, and that's not doing any good. And finally got low enough he could recognize objects on the ground. So that's when he pulled his ripcord and his chute opened. And anytime when that happened, there was a huge jerk.
Yeah.
Because you're falling, and then all of a sudden, boom, that canopy opens, and it knocks you right up.
Yeah, and they ended up in an area of southern Belgium.
Yes, actually, my dad and the plane. My dad was the last one to bail out because he was the commander.
Mm-hmm.
Or captain, if you will. They came down in Belgium, and the rest of the crew that bailed out came down across the border in France. They were brought back over the border into Belgium, either by Germans who captured them or by members of the resistance who brought them to safe houses in Belgium. And then their adventures, all took place after that.
In his diary, Howard Snyder wrote this, quote, "The fire was getting so hot, I could hardly stand it. My neck was burning and I pulled my scarf over the exposed skin. My nose, cheeks, eyebrows, eyelids, and lower forehead must have been burned when I was using the fire extinguisher. I left the cockpit and crawled down the escape hatch. I was surprised to see Benny and Dan still in the nose. We went through the nose hatch. It didn't occur to me at the time, but I believe the interphone and autopilot were shot out because the ship crashed 1 or 2 kilometers from where I landed. When I jumped, the bomb bay doors were still open. As I crawled through the escape hatch, I recalled the discussion we had about clearing them when jumping and wondered if I would. I did."
The second half of the book is about all what happened afterwards, about what happened to each member of the crew and about all the Belgian people that risked their lives trying to help them.
Fantastic. You're following like these different people's lives, and they all had different experiences. It gives you a whole sort of sense of what was going on the ground in terms of the war, because Belgium at the time was occupied by the Germans, but there were lots of people who were not happy with the Germans, who were willing to risk their lives to hide downed American pilots. And then there was a very strong resistance movement as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people, whether it's Belgium, the Netherlands, northern France, they were unbelievably brave people. They risked not only their lives, but the lives of their family and friends, because if the German secret police, the Gestapo, found out about it, they'd be arrested, tortured, and either shot or sent to a concentration camp. And some of the people who helped my dad and other members of his crew did meet that fate.
Yeah.
And then because you had the resistance, but then there were also, at that point in the war, wasn't quite sure, who was going to win. So you had a lot of collaborators too that would tell the Germans about downed airmen, or they tell about Belgian people that were resisting, Yeah, so it was a very scary time.
Very scary time. You describe a group of guys who end up hiding out in a forest. They have their own little camp there. And it's not just members of your dad's crew. It's not just Americans also, right? It's kind of a varied group.
Well, there were different points through. Well, it gets a little complicated without going in. But two of my dad's crew, they ended up in this resistance camp, and there you had members of other downed B-17s, but also members of the resistance. You had different men that were prisoners of war, various nationalities that escaped from prisoners of war camp. Then you had other men that were hiding from the Nazis because they didn't want to be sent back as slave labor to Germany. And that camp was raided in February, February 22nd, a couple of weeks later, from my dad's plane being shot down. And so then all the Americans kind of fled together, but then they met up with other downed U.S. airmen, and it ended up that there were 10 airmen hiding in the woods outside of Chimay, Belgium, in this hut that these two Belgian men, along with help from the airmen, they built this hut in the woods to hide until they could get into escape routes and then back to England. When the underground of the resistance found down airmen, they tried to get them back to England. There were a number of escape routes set up. So the airmen would go down through France, over the Pyrenees, into Spain, and then out through British-controlled Gibraltar.
Wow.
So a lot of guys that were shot down did escape that way. And so these guys were hiding in his hut, trying to get out. In fact, two of the 10, they took out off on their own, and they amazingly made it back to England. But that ended up being 8 airmen from 4 different B-17s that were hiding in this hut.
Yeah, and the route you describe, I mean, it's really crossing Europe. It is not easy. This must have taken them weeks to move all the way to Spain, and the cooperation of all different resistance groups along the way.
Oh, unbelievable. The most famous one is the Comet Line that was set up by this 22-year-old girl, nicknamed last name Didi De Jong. Didi was her kind of an alias. Yeah, you had all these different networks, and so they'd try to get these guys who were shot down in the Netherlands or in Belgium, down into France, to Paris typically, and they would be traveling. They'd be walking, riding bicycles, taking buses. They'd have to get a train down toward near the French border, and you had Germans on these planes. Germans were all over the place because all these countries are occupied.
Yeah.
And then you had infiltrators into these networks that would arrest the helpers. And I mean, it was super dangerous. And then when you got down to Spain and to go over the Pyrenees, those are high mountains, and it's very rugged boulders.
Yeah.
And snow and sleet. These guys didn't have mountain gear on. They just had, normal their clothes and normal boots, and it was a hard, arduous trip.
It's incredible.
Spain was neutral at the time, but they were more allied with the Germans, the Nazis. So it was quite a trip getting through those escape routes.
No, when you describe that, it's really fascinating because you think of all the cooperation it takes between all these different little sort of local organizations. And these men, as you say, that they have nothing. They don't speak the language. They don't have any equipment. They don't have papers. So they have to have forged papers. Really amazing that there was that level of cooperation and resistance in these countries.
Yeah, and there was a problem because the Americans, they had different traits than the Europeans. For example, Europeans didn't put their hands in their pockets. Europeans didn't jingle change in their pocket like GIs did. They held their cigarettes differently.
Yeah.
There's all these little different traits that could, expose you to the Nazis or a collaborator.
Yeah. So let's talk about your father's specific experience, because he ends up in Belgium and he's just sort of being moved around and taken care of. It's a rural area. They're mostly sort of small farmers. And as you say, they're putting themselves in tremendous danger. If they're caught harboring an American, a pilot, they're going to go off to a concentration camp. They're going to get beaten up, as some of them are. But for your father, what was it like when he talked about that experience?
Well, it was a harrowing experience. Well, first of all, his plane's attacked, it's on fire. He has to bail out, and he comes down in a foreign country, has no idea where he is, doesn't know what happened to his other buddies on the crew. He's all by himself, can't communicate with the U.S. military. He's being helped by complete strangers who cannot communicate. They can't speak English. He can't speak French. He has a little French-English dictionary in his escape kit he could try to refer to. And any of these people could be a collaborator and turn him over to the Nazis.
Yeah.
He came down in some trees right at the French-Belgian border, and his parachute got hung up in the trees. He's dangling 20 feet off the ground and can't get down. But fortunately for him, a couple young Belgian men, Henri Franken and Raymond Dervan, came to his rescue before the Germans got to him. They helped him down from the tree and told him to stay put and hide because it was daylight, and they thought it was too dangerous to try to move him in daylight. Mm-hmm. They told him they'd come back at nighttime and get him, which they did, and they took him to the Dervan farmhouse, where he stayed one night because, again, they thought it was too dangerous for him to stay there any longer than that. And then the next night, a Belgian customs officer, Paul Tilcan, came on a tandem bicycle to take him to a safer location. And as you mentioned, after that, he was moved from place to place to place.
In his diary, Howard wrote about a night he was out with Paul Tilquin, and they ran into some Germans. Quote, "It was a miserable night. Cold, black as the ace of spades, and raining cats and dogs. We left riding a tandem bicycle, which I could only pedal with my right leg, as my left had been injured during the attack. There was a tavern or cafe at the crest of the hill, and when we reached it, 2 German Luftwaffe officers came out with their girlfriends, who were laughing and giggling. One of the officers came up to my side, put an arm around me, and proceeded to jabber some drunken German, asking for a light for their cigarettes. I was scared because I spoke no German or French and did not know what to do. Fortunately, Paul did. He gave them a light. The German let loose of me to light a cigarette. Paul made up some excuse to get away, and we hurried on as quickly as we could."
How long he stayed in any given location depended on how brave the Belgian people were who lived there and how dangerous the Belgian underground thought it was for him to stay there. He might spend one night, he might spend 6 weeks. But my dad, he loved those Belgian people. He kept in touch with them until the day they died. They would correspond, they'd send Christmas cards.
Wow.
He viewed them as saving his life. They would let him sleep in their beds. They'd sleep on the floor. Everything was rationed back then, or, very limited food. Unless you had a little money, you could buy stuff on the black market. They'd eat less food and give him more. They were just so thankful for the Allies and the Americans, risking their lives to liberate them from Nazi occupation and Nazi oppression.
Wow.
But it was very, strenuous being hidden, because there were several times that are described in the book of him almost being discovered. And so you didn't know if any moment the Gestapo could bust into a house and you'd be arrested.
Sure. And meanwhile, your mother is back in California She just gets a telegram saying the plane is missing, all the men are missing in action.
They're shot down on February 8th. They get a telegram from the War Department on February 23rd saying, the plane was shot down and all these guys are missing in action. So the wives, the mothers, the sweethearts, they all start sending in letters. My mother was kind of the central point, as my dad was the commander of the crew. They kind of looked as my mother was kind of who the other women looked to. And there's lots of excerpts in those letters in the book that are very personal and very moving, because you could just, feel the fear and the trepidation they had that they might never see their loved one again.
Yeah.
They did get a little hope. 3 of my dad's crew became prisoners of war, and they were able to write home. Mm-hmm. So they knew then that those 3 were safe, although they did learn that 2 of the crew members had died. So 5 of the crew were accounted for, but the other 5, no one knew what happened to them for months and months and months.
Yeah. Wow. What a story. And then your dad ends up joining the resistance.
Yeah. He got tired of hiding, and word came that the Allies had landed at Normandy on D-Day, June 6th. And he decided to get back in the fight. Unlike most airmen, he had a year's infantry training before he volunteered for the Air Force, so he knew how to fight on the ground. And his helpers tried to talk him out of doing this because it was so dangerous, because he could die fighting against the Germans, or if they captured him, they'd shoot him on the spot as a spy.
Sure.
And the safest thing to do, or the smartest thing to do for him would just be to stay hidden and hunkered down until the U.S. armies came up from France after D-Day to liberate the area.
Yeah.
But he thought, there were men dying for the U.S. and he felt it was his duty to get back in the fight. And I don't know how many people would have made that decision.
I don't think
it took bravery and courage.
There was a man with him. I guess we won't mention his name, and he said, he decided to just stay put. I'm not going out there.
Yeah, he wasn't really with him. The tail gun
in the same area
was also missing in action.
Yeah.
Unlike my dad, he stayed with one woman and her 2 daughters for the entire 7 months. Mm-hmm. Unlike my dad, that was moved all over the place. Mm-hmm. But my dad was older too. My dad was an old guy. He was 28. Mm-hmm. So he was pops or grandpa. The tail gunner, Bill Schlenker, he was only 19 years old, and he was scared to death.
I bet.
So there's no way he was moving.
So your dad's moving around. I mean, he's got a bicycle. They give him a card, identification card, saying that he's deaf and dumb, so he doesn't have to speak. And it works. I mean, he has, as you say, close encounters with Germans all the time, but he manages to survive. And then at night, he's doing operations with this resistance group.
Yeah, well, he was being hidden. He would take buses or trains with someone's helper, and there'd be Germans on the train. So I can't imagine, how, you'd be scared to death.
And he's 6'3", so he doesn't blend in.
No, he was a lot taller than, the local Belgian people. They put a beret on him, to make him, try to blend in. But
yeah.
Then one of his helpers, Amy Cools, they rode bicycles across the border into France to meet up with a unit of the French resistance. They were referred to as the Maquis. They were independent ragtag, small independent guerrilla groups all across France. And their job was to harass the Germans. They would sabotage railroad lines, disrupt communications, attack convoys, and assassinate German officers. And they got their instructions from the British through coded messages over the BBC. And my dad said the information they gave him was unbelievably accurate.
Wow.
If they said a German convoy was coming down this road on this date at this time, sure enough, they'd be there. And that it was a result of the British cracking the German Enigma code and knowing all about that they're up to. And then they were supplied by the British through airdrops. Mm-hmm. So they had several encounters described in the book about attacking German convoys.
Incredible. And then eventually the Americans show up.
Right. On September 2nd of 44, word came that there were U.S. troops in a nearby village of Trélone, France. So my dad walks into the town square, goes up to an army major. It was a unit of Patton's Third Army, which had come up through France after D-Day. And my dad identified himself. They interrogated him, made sure he was who he said he was. And then he hopped on got a ride with a convoy taking German prisoners to Paris. And then from there, he hopped on a transport and got back to his base in England, where he sent a telegram to my mother saying he was, back at base, fit as a fiddle. And and that ended 7 months of, my mother and, all, the relatives.
Wow. And your mother had just given birth to your sister.
Right. Yeah. Nancy was born while my dad was missing in action. So getting back to England, he found out that the baby was a girl, rather than Stevie. I came back. I came along a little later.
Wow. What a moment.
Yeah. What a joyous day that was.
Oh my God. I can't even imagine. Wow. And then he made it back and had a great life. But as you talk about it in the book, he never forgot these people in Belgium who helped him and communicated with them and went back to visit. They were almost like his second family. These people had experienced such an intense situation, and through barriers of communication and through language and culture, it was just their humanity that held them together and their wanting to protect their freedoms from the Nazis.
Absolutely. One of the places he stayed at for a lengthy period of time, next door was a 16-year-old girl, Mimi Gabriel, that could speak English, and she taught him conversational French. They would play play card games, Monopoly board games or crossword puzzles. And so my dad got to be able to speak conversational French as a result of that. I've been to Belgium 6 times. My first trip was in 1994 with my parents. And that's when it became personal for me, because I met a couple of my dad's helpers and I went around. It's amazing. As you mentioned, all this took place in southern Belgium, called Wallonia, where it's all rural farmland, and it hasn't changed in hundreds of years. So all those houses, and farm houses and location of where that hut was, they're all there today, where you can go and visit, and see where history took place. And
amazing.
So that was amazing for me. And I'm going back again this fall to attend the 80th anniversary of the celebrations of the liberation of Belgium, and ceremonies to my dad's crew. And
fantastic.
I've developed, I've now friends with, some of the descendants of those Belgian people that helped my dad. And it is like family, even for us.
Yeah.
Even today, the Belgian people are still so thankful and so grateful, for being liberated from Nazi oppression.
Yeah.
And they do a great job, unlike the U.S., of educating the younger generations of the importance of remembering and honoring these events. So I can't wait to go back. These celebrations and ceremonies are just unbelievably moving and fun for that matter.
Wow. What an experience. And as you said, 3 other guys were taken prisoner by the Germans, and they had a whole different experience. They're staying in stalags, and they're being moved around and go through absolutely horrendous situations. One of them had lost a foot. Unbelievable. And yet they made it back. They had full lives afterwards. These stories need to be preserved. They're just absolutely incredible stories. And there's so much history. They kind of covered all of Europe and all these different areas and what they were going through. And it's really an incredible story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, it was Joe Musial, the waist gunner, who lost a foot. He and the bombardier, Richard Daniels, they were both so seriously injured that they were repatriated back to the U.S. in February of 1945 before the war ended.
Yeah.
But each guy, the B-17 had a 10-man crew, so each one of the guys had a different story. Some ended tragically, and some ended, happily.
Yeah.
Because 5 made it, but 5 did not.
Yeah. And I bet those 5 were lifetime friends.
Yeah, they would get together now and then. I met him as a little boy, young, but at the time I didn't really, know what was going on. And now I look back at it and I go, yes, and have regrets. But yeah, they would get together, and socialize now and then. I have, lots of pictures and videos, that they took back then, and so I have that memory. But I became friends with many of their, descendants, kids, cousins, and or grandkids, grandnieces or nephews, and so that's very rewarding too.
Well, Steve, it's really a remarkable, remarkable story. I'm so glad that you preserved it in your book. I recommend it to everybody. Heroism, history, humanity. It's very moving. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate you having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. And your dad, he was a very kind of quintessentially American character.
Yeah.
And clearly the goodness in his heart came through because these people were willing to help him, moved by his humanity.
Absolutely. And, like all those World War II veterans, they were very, very humble guys. They didn't look at themselves as heroes.
Right.
They were just one of millions who, did a job that they had to do and then come back to the U.S. and got on with their lives, to build a life for them and their family and, and to better the country.
Amazing history that needs to be preserved and needs to be passed on to our children.
It's our duty to remember.
The resistance group that Howard fought with were the Marquis, which translated means men of the scrublands. They were a group of rural French and Belgian resistance fighters, initially composed of young, mostly working-class men who had escaped into the mountains and woods to avoid conscription into the occupied France compulsory work service, which provided forced labor for Germany. To avoid capture and deportation to Germany, they became increasingly organized into active resistance groups that employed guerrilla tactics to harass German occupation troops. They boasted an estimated 25,000 to 40,000 members in autumn of 1943 and approximately 100,000 members in June 1944. On August 8, 1945, Howard wrote to his wife Ruth, quote, "7 months ago today, I was shot down. It is impossible to tell you in a letter of all the heartbreak, disappointments, and experiences I have had in that time, how I worried about you carrying the baby and learning that I was missing." After the war, Howard Snyder settled down with his family in Pasadena, California, where he owned and managed a small restaurant known as Snyder's Coffee Shop. He never forgot the courageous men he had served with or the gallant Belgians who had helped him. Quote, "They were wonderful people, brave people who risked their lives to keep me from being captured," he later said. "They couldn't do enough for me." We thank Howard Snyder for his heroic service to our country and his son Steve for his moving book, Shot Down. It's my great honor to name Howard and Steve Snyder as today's Heroes Behind the Headlines.
Heroes Behind Headlines. Executive producer Ralph Pizzullo. Produced and engineered by Mike Dawson. Music provided by Extreme Music. For exclusive content, please join our Patreon group at patreon.com/Heroes Behind Headlines.